May I have your leftovers, sir? And in that moment, Daniel Whitmore's world simply stopped. Chicago, Illinois. The Hearthstone Room wasn't just a restaurant. It was a fortress of taste, wealth, and power. The kind of place where dessert came with a signature, not a spoon. Where jazz curled through the chandeliers like smoke from another century. Where no one asked for permission, because no one ever needed anything, except her. At table 12, near a wall of living orchids and moody candlelight, Daniel Whitmore sat in silence. 48 years old, dressed in a charcoal Armani suit tailored so perfectly it seemed grown from his skin, he looked like a statue carved out of loss. His steak sat untouched. His Bordeaux glass full, undisturbed. His expression unreadable. Except to someone who'd known pain, and not the kind a checkbook could fix. Across from him was an empty chair. Not physically vacant, no. It held the ghost of someone. Two someones, actually. His wife, Claire, and his little boy, Aiden. 10 years. 10 years since the crash. 10 years of waking up with silence. So Daniel had learned to live around the ache, with wealth, with noise, with meetings and mergers and a glass of something aged 40 years to match the time he felt carved out of him. He came here every Friday night not to eat, but to remember, or to pretend he still could. And then came the voice. "May I have your leftovers, sir?" Not loud, not timid, but real. Too real for this place. He blinked. Beside his table stood a girl, no older than 19. Pale, exhausted, blonde hair pulled into a loose bun with strands falling like fatigue across her cheeks. Her coat was threadbare, hanging off her like apology. But she didn't look down. She didn't flinch. She held something, someone, in her arms. A baby. No older than 8 months. Eyes round as moons. Fixated on the mashed potatoes cooling on Daniel's plate. The baby made a soft sound, a breathless coo, as if hope had a voice. Around them, the air froze. Conversation slowed. Forks stopped mid-air. A waiter's eyebrows rose and his feet began moving forward, already rehearsing an apology. But Daniel raised a hand. Just a flick of his fingers. The waiter halted. Daniel turned back to the girl, studied her. There was no shame in her, no performance, no manipulation, just exhaustion, and something far stronger, dignity. She didn't look like someone who begged. She looked like someone who had already given everything she had, except the child in her arms. Her voice trembled, but her stance did not. She wasn't asking for herself. She was asking for him. Daniel's throat tightened. The flicker of a candle danced between them, casting gold over her chapped lips, her trembling jaw, her thin fingers curled around the baby's side like armor. He saw it, what others didn't. Not just poverty, sacrifice. Something stirred in him. Not pity, not charity, but something terrifyingly close to awakening. 10 years. 10 years of building walls, and now, one question, a whisper, cracked it. She held his gaze. Daniel, a man once voted most unreadable CEO on earth, found himself blinking, vulnerable, breathing unevenly. Her shoes were soaked in sidewalk slush, her fingers pink from cold, and yet she stood like a lioness protecting a cub. He looked at the food, then back to her, and with a voice he didn't recognize as his own, he said softly, "Take it." She didn't lunge. She didn't devour. Instead, with grace Daniel hadn't seen in the richest gala, she pulled out a small piece of cloth, frayed but clean, and gently wrapped the potatoes and meat into a soft bundle, like it was gold dust, not leftovers. Then she knelt, yes. She knelt, softly, like a prayer. Cradling the baby against her chest, she pulled a small plastic spoon from her coat pocket. Her hands didn't shake. She scooped a bit of potato, blew on it, and fed the child with care so tender it made Daniel's fingers curl against the edge of the table. The baby's lips opened. A sound came out. Joy, pure and gurgling. A smile spread across his face like spring across a frozen field. A smile Daniel hadn't seen since Aiden. Daniel looked away, only for a second. But the air changed. The light dimmed, and he looked back, as if drawn by something sacred. Sophie was still kneeling, still feeding, one spoon at a time. She didn't look around, didn't check who was watching. She was only there, for him, for Leo. Daniel's heart did something strange. It didn't break. It softened. She wasn't just surviving. She was loving. And in that moment, that impossible, ordinary moment, Daniel Whitmore felt something in him start to come alive again. The baby cooed once more. Sophie smiled faintly. Not to Daniel, not to anyone, just to her son. And then she stood, wrapped the food, adjusted the blanket around the baby, and turned. No dramatic goodbye, no plea. Just a soft nod, not of thanks, but of something unspoken, like she had seen into his soul and left it intact. She walked away, her figure retreating between crystal tables and astonished stares, into the cold night beyond. Daniel sat frozen. The candle flickered, the wine untouched. The chair across from him, still empty, but for the first time in a decade he wanted to move. He rose, not fast, not slow, but with intention. He placed his napkin gently on the plate, nodded once to the stunned waiter, and walked out through the doors. After her, not knowing why, not knowing what he was chasing, only knowing one thing. She didn't just ask for food. She reminded me I still have a heart. The night air wrapped around Daniel like memory, cold, thin, and filled with things he couldn't quite name. He stepped outside the hearthstone room, the gold-lit dining hall fading behind him like a distant echo. The doorman said something polite, maybe even concerned, but Daniel didn't hear it. He had already seen her vanish into the dark. And so, without fanfare, without any clear plan, Daniel Whitmore, billionaire, widower, untouchable, followed a barefoot girl with a baby into the Chicago night. The sidewalk pulsed with life, but Daniel moved like a shadow, a silent figure in an expensive coat, eyes scanning every alley, every crosswalk. The city buzzed around him, horns, voices, lights, but all he could see was her. She turned the corner at 11th and Ashland. He quickened his pace, careful not to appear like he was chasing, though in truth, he was. She didn't walk like someone afraid. She walked like someone exhausted. She crossed under a flickering street lamp and slipped through a narrow passage between two old brick buildings. Daniel hesitated only for a breath before stepping in after her. At the end of the passage was a crumbling lot, cracked asphalt, weeds clawing through the edges, and abandoned cars like rusted skeletons forgotten by time. But one wasn't abandoned. It was an old navy blue sedan, dented, flaking paint, one window covered with cardboard. It shouldn't have stood out, but it was lived in. That's where she went. No hesitation, no looking over her shoulder. She opened the back door, shifted the baby in her arms, and climbed in as if it were home. Daniel stopped just before the last line of shadow. He didn't speak, didn't dare. From his distance, he could barely see her silhouette inside the car. The way she folded herself into the back seat, her arms still wrapped tightly around the child. She moved with quiet purpose, laying the baby down on a thin blanket. The car had no crib, no pillows, just a space cleared out between old coats and bags. Then her voice floated up through the broken window. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." It wasn't sung for beauty. It was sung for safety, a lullaby against the dark. Daniel stood transfixed. Every note pierced something old in him. The child's soft sounds mingled with her melody like the city had gone still just to listen. He wasn't supposed to be here, but he couldn't move. The baby's small hand reached up, tugged gently at her shirt collar. She smiled, and in that tiny flicker of joy, Daniel saw Claire again. Not her face, not her voice, but the way she once held Aiden, cradled in the late hours, singing songs that made no sense but always made everything better. The girl, Sophie, he would learn later, didn't seem to notice him at first. Or maybe she did, and just didn't care. But something must have stirred her awareness because she turned, and their eyes locked. She froze, only for a moment. Daniel stepped into the light, hands raised slightly, palms open. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "I just wanted to see if you were okay." Her body shifted slightly, protective. "You followed me," she said, not accusing, just stating. He nodded. "Yes, I did." There was a long silence between them, broken only by the wind nudging a nearby newspaper across the asphalt. Then she said quietly, "Most people don't care." Daniel swallowed. "That's not true." "It is," she said, glancing down at her child, "but it's okay. I stopped expecting them to." "What's his name?" Daniel asked. She hesitated. "Leo." Daniel repeated it under his breath. "Leo. He's 8 months," she added, eyes softening slightly. "Loves mashed potatoes, even cold." Daniel smiled. Not politely, but from someplace real. "So did my son." The air changed again. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry, just listened. And that, somehow, meant more than any comfort Daniel had been offered in 10 years. After a long pause, she added, "I was studying to be a nurse. Had a scholarship. Then I got pregnant." Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The father left. My parents said I ruined everything. So I left instead. She looked around the car. "We've been living here for about 2 months. I clean houses, wait tables when I can." Daniel's gaze dropped to the worn floor mats. A baby sock was curled in the corner like a forgotten prayer. "I can help," he said. "A hotel, food, whatever you need." She raised a hand. "I'm not asking for money." Surprised, he asked softly, "Then what do you want?" She looked down at Leo, who had finally drifted to sleep. His tiny fingers still clutched her jacket. Then she said, barely above a whisper, "Just one day. One day where he's warm, full, and safe." Daniel didn't know why that hit him harder than any demand ever could. Maybe it was the way she said it, like it wasn't even a dream worth holding. Just a breath she hoped might last a little longer. The street lamp above flickered, casting an amber glow over her hair. For just a second, in that soft, imperfect light, Daniel saw something that shattered him. Her eyes. Not identical to Claire's, but close enough. Close enough to crack open a memory. The way Sophie held Leo, the way she stood tall even with nothing, made something twist in Daniel's chest. It wasn't pity. It wasn't attraction. It was recognition. He stepped back, steadying himself against a gust of wind. "Thank you," he said suddenly. She tilted her head. "For what?" He looked at her. The car, the child, the quiet fierceness in her bones. "For reminding me I still have a heart." She didn't smile, didn't nod. She just looked down at Leo and pulled the blanket a little tighter, and kept singing. Daniel stood there for a long time until the cold finally settled into his bones. Then he turned, slowly, and walked back through the lot, through the alley, back toward the world that had never known a girl like Sophie. But he knew, and he would not forget. Daniel Whitmore had built empires with precision. He made his first fortune by seeing patterns no one else did, patterns in code, in markets, in people. He was known for his silence in boardrooms, his stillness in negotiations, and for never reacting emotionally to anything. But that was before a 19-year-old girl with tired eyes and a baby in her arms shattered the silence he'd worn like armor for 10 years. Now, Daniel couldn't sleep. It wasn't insomnia. It wasn't guilt. It was something stranger, more uncomfortable. A pull. Like his heart had been reactivated, but not gently. As if someone had found a dusty power line in his chest and flipped the switch without warning. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about Sophie, about the way she wrapped mashed potatoes in cloth like they were jewels, about the way her baby, Leo, smiled at candlelight like it was sunrise, about the way she didn't ask for help. She asked for dignity. The next morning, Daniel did something he hadn't done in years. He walked. No driver, no security detail, just him, a jacket, and a small bag in his hand. He returned to the same broken parking lot behind St. Bridget's Church. The air still smelled like damp brick and old leaves. The alley was quiet except for the occasional cough of traffic from a block away. The navy blue sedan was still there. He didn't knock, didn't announce himself. He didn't want gratitude, didn't need acknowledgement. He simply placed a brown paper bag by the back tire, warm baby formula, 2 diapers, and a note that only said, "For Leo." He turned and walked away. He returned the next day, and the day after that, each time earlier than the sun. Each time leaving something small but vital, a wool blanket, a thermos of soup, a pack of wet wipes, a new bottle for feeding. No notes, no names, just presence. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He just didn't know how to forget. Meanwhile, Sophie noticed. At first, she was cautious. Distrust was second nature to anyone who had lived her life. The world had taught her to expect strings, to brace for betrayal. But these packages, they were different. There were no demands, no instructions, no expectation that she smile or perform gratitude. She watched from the rear window one morning, breath fogging the glass, as Daniel placed a sealed bag gently on the ground and disappeared into the gray light like a man vanishing from his own dream. She whispered into the silence, "Why?" Leo, stirring in her lap, offered a soft coo in reply. One morning, she found a note tucked into a blanket. Not handwritten. Typed, neat, impersonal, yet the words were anything but. A pediatrician from Mercy Memorial does church outreach every Friday. No cost, no paperwork. He'll stop by the church lot if you're comfortable. No pressure. D. Sophie stared at the paper for a long time. She didn't trust kindness, not easily, but Leo's cough had returned, so she said yes. Dr. Ellis was gentle, quiet, and professional. He didn't ask questions, didn't pry. He checked Leo's breathing, weight, color, gave Sophie some tips, left a few free samples. Then, as he was packing up, he looked at her and said, "Whoever made this happen, they care. I just hope you know that." She didn't reply, but after he left, she held Leo longer than usual and whispered, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Meanwhile, Daniel sat in his penthouse office, ignoring 37 unread emails and a meeting request from a billionaire in Singapore. His mind was back in that parking lot, on a girl who never asked, and a baby who didn't know how to. He didn't know what he was doing. He just knew he had to keep doing it. One day, he left a book, a board book. Brown Bear, what do you see?" Inside, a $10 bookstore gift card, not cash, never cash, and a note. "Read it to him when the city gets too loud." The next morning, Daniel arrived early, just before sunrise, and for the first time, she was waiting. She didn't say anything at first, just stood beside the car, arms folded across her chest. Leo pressed gently to her shoulder. "I don't know what you want," she said softly, "but I can't give more than I already am." Daniel didn't move. "I don't want anything." "Then why are you here?" He hesitated. "I think He paused, looked at her, really looked. "I think I'm here because you stayed." She tilted her head. "In that restaurant, everyone else looked away, even me. But you looked straight at me and stayed, and I haven't been the same since." Sophie blinked. Then, after a moment, she said, "Leo's never had anyone but me." Daniel smiled faintly. "That makes two of us." They stood there in the soft morning silence, city slowly waking behind them. The wind shifted, and Sophie pulled her coat tighter. Daniel reached into his pocket and offered her a pair of gloves. Thick, warm, still wrapped in store plastic. She hesitated, then took them. Just as she slipped them on, Leo opened his eyes and gave Daniel a sleepy grin. It was the kind of smile that rewrote endings. Daniel turned to leave, but before he did, Sophie said, "Thank you." He stopped, looked back. His voice almost caught as he replied, "You're welcome. But it's not charity. It's recognition." That night, Sophie fed Leo mashed potatoes from a warmed container left on the hood. She held the book on her lap, reading with soft voices, even as city sirens wailed in the background like distant storms. And Daniel? He stood on his balcony, 47 floors above the city, watching the lights blink on and off like signals in code. Except for one steady light, a little blue sedan behind a church, that never seemed to flicker anymore. And that was enough to make him smile. It began with a restlessness. Leo, usually quiet in his sleep, began to twitch and whimper. Sophie thought it was a bad dream. Maybe hunger, maybe the cold. She shifted his blanket, rocked him gently, hummed the lullaby he always loved. "You are my sunshine." But this time, the song didn't work. By midnight, he wouldn't take the bottle, his face flushed, skin clammy, and when Sophie touched his forehead, her heart dropped. He was burning. She whispered his name over and over, like prayer. "Leo, baby, look at me." His eyes fluttered but didn't focus. His breathing quickened shallow and fast. The kind of breathing Sophie had only read about in textbooks, back when she still believed she'd be a nurse. Her training came rushing back, but without tools, without a thermometer, it meant little. Just terror wrapped in memory. She held Leo closer, rocking harder, no longer humming, just begging. "Please, not you too." By 2 a.m., she knew she couldn't wait. She wrapped Leo in every piece of fabric she owned, tied him to her chest, and ran. Through the empty streets of Chicago, past late-night traffic and shuttered stores, to the only place left, Mercy Memorial Hospital. The fluorescent lobby lights stabbed her eyes. The front desk clerk didn't even look up. "I need help," Sophie gasped, breathless. "He has a fever. He's not responding." The woman glanced over her glasses. "Do you have insurance?" Sophie shook her head. "No, but he's not okay. He's only 8 months. We're at full capacity tonight. You'll have to wait, or go to another facility." Sophie blinked. Her voice cracked. "Please, he's burning up. He won't eat. He won't cry anymore." The woman's face stayed hard. "I'm sorry. We can't take liability without proper intake." Proper intake. As if Leo were a line item, a risk to be calculated. Sophie stepped back. Her knees nearly gave out. She held Leo tighter. Not to calm him, but to keep herself from falling apart. She stumbled out into the cold. Outside, the wind bit through her coat. The city was empty, the sky blank. She looked at her phone. Cracked, old, barely charged. Her thumb hovered, and then she typed 2 words. "Help us." 6 minutes later, a black SUV tore around the corner like it didn't care about red lights. Tires screeched. The engine hadn't even stopped when Daniel jumped out. His hair was a mess, shirt untucked, no coat, no driver, just him, eyes wild with urgency. He didn't speak, he just held out his arms. Sophie didn't hesitate. She placed Leo in his hands, and for the first time that night the baby didn't resist. He curled his fingers around Daniel's thumb like he knew. Daniel turned, stormed through the glass doors of the ER. The receptionist looked up, startled. "Sir, I want a doctor. Now," Daniel said, voice like thunder wrapped in velvet. "This child has a critical fever. I don't care about your policy. I'll cover every cent. But if you let one more minute pass—" He leaned in. "I'll buy this hospital and fire every single person who made that baby wait." Leo was taken instantly. The nurses moved fast now. Fever protocols, oxygen checks, IV lines. Sophie collapsed onto a waiting room bench, hands shaking. She didn't even realize Daniel had sat beside her until his coat wrapped around her shoulders. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to cry, but all she could do was breathe. An hour passed, then another. The nurse came out at dawn, her eyes kind but tired. "He's stable," she said. "The fever's down. He's resting now." Sophie exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since midnight. Her whole body sagged. She turned to Daniel. "You came," she whispered. He nodded. "Of course I did." And that's when the tears came. Fast, hot, uncontrollable. She leaned into him, not gently but like a wave crashing into a rock. Her body shook with exhaustion, fear, and a grief that had nowhere else to go. Daniel said nothing. He didn't shush her, didn't tell her it would be okay. He just held her. For 10 years, he hadn't let anyone close. And now, in a sterile hallway at sunrise, holding a girl who once asked for his leftovers, Daniel Whitmore finally allowed himself to care again. It didn't feel like betrayal to Claire and Aidan. It felt like healing. They didn't talk about love that night. There were no confessions. But something unspoken passed between them, something truer than declarations. Sophie didn't have to be strong anymore. Not alone. And Daniel? He didn't want to be untouched anymore. Somewhere down the hall, Leo stirred in his crib. The sound was soft, like a sigh, and Daniel smiled. He had heard that sound before, not from Leo, but from Aidan, years ago, in another life, and somehow it had come back to him, not in memory, but in the living, breathing warmth of a child who had no idea he had just changed everything. The sun had begun to bleed softly through the tall windows of Mercy Memorial when the nurse returned. "Leo is sleeping," she said, breathing steadily. "Fever's gone. You can see him in a bit, but let him rest." Sophie's legs nearly gave out from relief. She didn't thank the nurse. She couldn't yet. She just nodded, hand over her chest like she was trying to keep her heart from falling apart. Daniel stood beside her, quiet, hands in the pockets of his slacks, rumpled shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. His hair was still out of place. His eyes were red-rimmed, and for once, he looked human. Not untouchable, not perfect, just there. They found a quiet bench in the corridor outside the pediatric wing. Sophie sat first, pulling the hospital blanket around her shoulders like armor. Daniel sat a few inches away. Not too close, not too far. The silence wasn't heavy. It was shared. "You didn't have to come," she said finally. He glanced sideways. "I know." "Then why?" Daniel exhaled. Not a sigh, just the kind of breath people forget they're allowed to take when grief has lived too long in their lungs. "I've been frozen," he said. She waited. "My wife," he continued, voice low, "Claire. And our son, Aidan. They were killed in a car accident 10 years ago. A truck ran a red light. I was late to dinner. I missed it by 10 minutes, but they didn't." Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She just turned fully toward him and listened. Daniel looked down at his hands. "Since then, I've built things. Companies, properties, a reputation. But nothing that mattered. I could buy half the world and still not feel a thing." He paused. "Until that night, at the restaurant." She looked away now, suddenly self-conscious. "I wasn't trying to make a scene." "You didn't," he said. "You woke something up." Another long silence. Then Sophie spoke. "I had a plan too," she said. "I was on track to be a nurse. Full scholarship to Loyola. I was supposed to graduate this year." "What happened?" Daniel asked. "I got pregnant." Her tone didn't wobble. She didn't apologize for it. "The father was older, said he'd stay, then disappeared the week I told him. My parents told me I could either give up the baby or leave their house." Daniel frowned. "So, you left?" Sophie nodded. "I don't regret it. Not even once, but I'd be lying if I said it hasn't been hard." She looked down at her hands, still holding the corner of the hospital blanket like a lifeline. "Some nights," she whispered, "I'd hold Leo and pretend we were camping. Tell him the stars outside the car window were special. That everything was okay, but most nights it wasn't." Daniel didn't speak, didn't offer solutions. He just looked at her like she wasn't broken, like she wasn't something to fix. "I hated the world for a long time," Sophie added, "but I never hated him." "Leo?" She nodded. "He saved me from myself, made me try harder than I ever thought I could. And sometimes, just sometimes, when he laughs, I think maybe I can still be someone." Daniel leaned back, gazing up at the ceiling, as if searching for something there. "I used to believe people like us couldn't start over," he said. "Not after that kind of loss." "And now?" she asked. He turned to her. "I think you're teaching me I was wrong." The hallway light shifted with the rising sun. Everything became softer, less clinical. Sophie pulled her knees to her chest. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his thighs. No one passed by, no nurses, no orderlies, just them, and quiet. "Do you think it's okay to feel again?" she asked suddenly. "Even if everything's not fixed?" Daniel smiled, faint but true. "I think it's the only time we can feel." She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time saw not just the man who brought baby formula or gave quiet gifts, but someone equally lost. Someone who wasn't saving her. But maybe saving with her. The nurse appeared quietly at the end of the hall. "You can see him now," she said. Sophie stood first, then paused, turned to Daniel. "Come with me?" she asked. His eyes softened. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I think he'd want to meet the man who carried him in like a storm." The room was dim and warm. Leo lay in a crib too big for him, one tiny hand wrapped around a plush dinosaur. His breathing was steady, peaceful. Sophie stepped in first, brushing the baby's hair back gently. Then, without words, she stepped aside. Daniel approached. He looked down at the boy who had unknowingly torn open a decade of ice around his chest. Leo stirred, blinked, and smiled. Small, groggy, but real. Daniel's hand trembled as he reached for the crib rail. Leo reached back. Their fingers touched, and something changed. Sophie stood at the door, watching them. A girl who'd lost her future. A man who'd lost his past. And between them, a child who didn't know what the world had taken, only what it still offered, hope. They stayed there for a long time. No words, no questions, just a kind of quiet that no longer hurt. And in that silence, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt since the night Claire died. A reason to breathe. It started with a photo, slightly blurry, taken from across the hospital parking lot at sunrise. A man in a rumpled white shirt, hair disheveled, stepping out of Mercy Memorial with a baby in his arms. And a young woman close behind. The internet saw it before Daniel even did. Billionaire tech mogul seen leaving hospital cradling baby. Mystery girl identified as teen single mom living in her car. From mashed potatoes to mansion? Within hours, it was everywhere. Paparazzi dug into Sophie's past, her name, her high school, her parents, her scholarship, her eviction, Her absence from social media was seen as suspicious. Some called her a fighter. Most called her a liar. She targeted him. Gold digger? Manipulative. He's going through a midlife crisis. That baby isn't even his. She planned this. By noon, the gossip had drowned the facts. And Sophie Bennett, who once whispered, "May I have your leftovers?" in a velvet restaurant corner, was now a trending topic with 10 million opinions, and not one of them kind. Daniel saw the storm unfold from the quiet of his penthouse. He didn't panic, but he ached. For Sophie, for Leo, for the fragile safety they had just begun to build. He called. She didn't answer. He texted. No reply. So he went. The apartment he'd arranged for her, modest, sunlit, safe, was cloaked in silence. He knocked. No sound. But then, through the door, a small voice. "It's unlocked." He stepped inside. The curtains were drawn. The TV was off. The room was dim, except for the cold glow of her phone screen lying on the floor. Headlines still flashing, relentless. Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, knees to her chest, arms around herself. Leo was sleeping in the crib nearby, oblivious to the noise of a world that had turned his mother into a spectacle. Daniel knelt. "I'm here." She didn't look up. "I can't do this," she whispered. "I can't let him grow up in this mess." "Sophie, I don't care what they say about me, but Leo? One day he'll see this, see how they talked about me. What if he believes them?" Daniel was silent for a moment, then, gently, "Then let me show them who you really are." That afternoon, Daniel made one phone call. Not to his lawyers, not to his PR team, but to his oldest friend, a journalist he trusted. "I want to speak. One time. One camera. No script." The next evening, millions tuned in. There was no grand set, no dramatic music, just a chair, a studio, a single light. Daniel sat down, unshaven, tired, human. The interviewer said little, only nodded. And then Daniel began. He didn't start with Sophie. He started with Claire and Aiden. He told the world what he hadn't told anyone in 10 years. About the accident, the silence, the emptiness he lived inside. People think money protects you, but when grief hits, no amount of gold lines the hole in your chest. He spoke slowly, clearly. His voice cracked more than once. Then, and only then, he told them about Sophie, about a girl in a restaurant holding a baby, asking for leftovers, about the dignity in her voice, the fierceness in her eyes. She wasn't begging, she was surviving, and she did it with grace most of us will never understand. He leaned forward. "She didn't take anything from me, she gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, a reason to care, a reason to breathe." He looked directly into the camera. "Sophie Bennett is not a story for your headlines. She's a mother. Leo is not a prop. He's a child with laughter in his chest and stars in his eyes. And I didn't rescue them. They saved me." When the interview ended, no one spoke. Not in the studio, not online. For once, the internet fell silent. And then, it erupted. Mothers shared their stories. Nurses posted videos about girls like Sophie who fall through the cracks. One woman in Kansas started a fundraiser called Leo's Light. It reached $100,000 in 72 hours. And, in a quiet apartment in Chicago, Sophie watched it all unfold from the same spot on the bed. But this time, not alone. Leo stirred in her arms. Daniel stood by the door. She didn't say anything for a while, then she looked up, eyes tired but clear. "If you still want us," she said, "we're here." Daniel didn't respond with words. He simply opened the door wider, and for the first time in years, the threshold wasn't just between rooms. It was between loneliness and something finally, quietly whole. The first thing Sophie brought into the apartment wasn't clothes. It was Leo. She stepped through the doorway with him asleep on her shoulder, wrapped in the same faded blanket that had seen too many cold nights. She stood in the entrance, eyes scanning the modest space Daniel had chosen. 2 bedrooms, warm gray walls, a small kitchen that smelled faintly of new paint and promise. No security gates, no marble, no opulence, just peace. She hadn't said much after the interview, neither had Daniel, but the next morning she showed up, not with a suitcase, just a baby. And a decision. "If you still want us," she'd whispered, "we're here." Daniel hadn't asked what they were, not roommates, not lovers, not anything with a label. He just nodded and stepped aside, letting her in like a man opening not just a door, but the walls around his own heart. He hadn't realized how quiet his life was until the sound of a baby's laughter began bouncing off his kitchen tiles. Sophie didn't unpack much. 2 duffel bags, a baby carrier, a threadbare notebook filled with nursing diagrams she'd once studied by streetlight. But within days, the apartment began to feel lived in. Leo's colorful onesies hung over the heater. A pair of baby socks peeked out from under the couch, and on the fridge, taped with care, a crayon drawing. A stick figure baby with yellow scribbles for hair and the word LEO spelled backward. Daniel left it there. He liked it better that way. Imperfect. Real. They never talked about routines, but one formed naturally. Each morning, Daniel would knock softly and let himself in. Sophie, already awake, would be at the stove, hair pulled into her usual bun, sweatshirt sleeves rolled past her elbows. Coffee brewed. Leo babbled in his high chair, banging a spoon like a drumstick. "Morning," she'd say. He always replied the same way. "How's my guy?" Leo would grin, arms lifted toward him. Daniel never resisted. He was learning how to hold a bottle, how to warm milk without overheating it, how to survive being peed on, and, perhaps most important, how to just be there. At first, Daniel came with excuses. Groceries, diapers, mail. Then, no excuses at all. He just showed up, sometimes with a book, sometimes with silence, sometimes with nothing but a willingness to sit beside a boy on a rug and make airplane noises until they both laughed so hard Sophie had to wipe tears from her cheeks. One afternoon, Sophie came home from a temp job cleaning offices. She found Daniel on the floor, Leo asleep in his lap. The TV was on low. Winnie the Pooh. Daniel wasn't even watching, just sitting still, letting the baby breathe against his chest. There was no rush, no hunger, no heat, just warmth, the kind that settled deep, that didn't flare, but stayed. Daniel began coming home early, not because he had to, because he wanted to. He started noticing things, like how Sophie always hummed while folding Leo's clothes, how she let him help even when it made things slower, how her hair always escaped its bun by noon, and how she never bothered fixing it when she was with Leo. He started noticing her. Not as a girl who once asked for his leftovers, not even as the woman who saved his heart, but as herself, Sophie. Steady, fierce, gentle, in ways that broke him more than grief ever could. One afternoon, rain spilled down the windows. Sophie had just given Leo his first bath in the big tub. He screamed like he was being tickled by God himself. Daniel sat on the floor, soaked from splash damage, laughing so hard he forgot to check his phone, for the first time in 15 years. Afterward, Sophie wrapped Leo in a towel shaped like a bear. Daniel whispered, "How did I live without this?" She paused, then said softly, "You didn't." That night, Leo stood for the first time without holding on. Just 2 seconds, 2 shaky, glorious seconds. He immediately fell on his diaper-padded bottom and laughed like he'd conquered Everest. Sophie clapped. Daniel, sitting on the carpet with his hands resting on his knees, said nothing. He only watched, face still, and then something shifted. His hands curled slightly, his eyes welled. He turned away just for a second. But Sophie saw it. "Daniel?" she asked. He shook his head, rubbed his eyes. "Sorry, I didn't mean—" "You don't have to hide it," he exhaled. "It just hit me." "What?" "That I missed this with Aiden, that I'll never get those firsts with him, but somehow, Leo is giving them back to me." Sophie stepped forward, gently touched his arm, and for the first time, Daniel let her, not out of weakness, but out of trust. They stood there a moment longer, Leo babbling in the background, the city humming through the windows, and, between them, nothing spoken, but everything heard. Later, after the baby slept, they sat on the balcony again. Same blanket, same sky, different hearts. Sophie turned to him. "You okay?" Daniel stared out at the lights. "I used to think love was grand gestures, but now, I think maybe it's remembering how someone takes their coffee." Sophie smiled, slow and soft. "That's how I knew my dad loved my mom," she said. "He never once said it, but he always got her coat out of the closet before she reached for it." Daniel looked at her, eyes searching, and for the first time he said it, not as a confession, but as a truth. "I love this. Not you, not us, just this, the thing they were creating without naming." Sophie nodded. "Me too." Neither moved closer, but neither moved away, because in that moment, under a sky filled with quiet stars and second chances, they both understood. Sometimes the strongest love is the one that doesn't need to be spoken. It just needs to be lived, quietly, faithfully, and every single day. It came in a plain white envelope, folded neatly under the apartment door. No return address, no seal, just her name, written in sharp, familiar strokes, Sophie. She didn't open it at first. She stared at it for hours, held it like something that might burn, like it had teeth. By the time Daniel returned from the grocery store, she was still on the couch, motionless, Leo asleep in the bassinet beside her, her fingers curled tight around the letter's edge. He paused, set the bag down gently, sat beside her. She didn't speak, so he waited. Then, quietly, she unfolded the paper. "Sophie, if there's still a chance to know my grandson, I would like to try. Mom." That was it. No apology, no long explanation. Just 12 words pressed too hard into the page, as if the pen had trembled with things it didn't dare say. Sophie read them over and over, her jaw set, her throat dry. She didn't cry, but the silence around her was thick enough to make breathing feel like grief. Daniel picked up the letter, read it once, then again. He folded it back carefully, placed it on the coffee table, and asked, "What are you thinking?" "I don't know," she said. "Do you want to go?" "I don't even know if she means it," Sophie whispered. "Last time I heard her voice, it was telling me I wasn't her daughter anymore." Daniel's brow tightened. "You don't owe them anything." Sophie looked at Leo, his chest rising and falling in rhythmic, gentle peace. "No," she said, "but maybe he does." She stood, pacing the room. "They missed everything. His first smile, his first laugh, the night he had a fever and I thought I'd lose him. They weren't there for any of it. Why now?" Daniel leaned forward. "Because something changed. They abandoned me," Sophie said, harsher now. "They cared more about what the neighbors would think than whether their daughter had a place to sleep." He stood too, walked toward her, not too close. "I know," he said, "but this isn't about giving them a clean conscience." "Then what is it?" He looked at her. "It's about making sure Leo never has to grow up with the same emptiness you've carried all these years." She froze. "Let him choose," Daniel added. "Let him meet them, or not. Forgive them, or not. But don't let silence be the story he inherits." 3 days later, they packed the car. It wasn't dramatic, just quiet. A diaper bag, a bottle, one stuffed giraffe, and the letter, folded one last time, placed in Sophie's coat pocket. They drove south for hours. The city faded. Billboards became trees. High-rises gave way to barns and broken fences. They reached Greenville, Indiana, just before dusk. It was the kind of town where gas stations doubled as diners, and every porch had a swing that knew too many secrets. Sophie hadn't been here since she left, pregnant, ashamed, and alone. Daniel parked at the bottom of the gravel driveway. The house looked the same, paint chipped, porch light flickering, curtains drawn. The wind stirred, carrying smells she remembered from childhood: honeysuckle, diesel, rain. She sat, frozen in the passenger seat, Leo squirming gently in her arms. Daniel didn't say anything, just placed a hand on her knee. Solid. Present. Then the front door opened. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, slightly stooped, hair tied back, worn sweater, her mother. Sophie stepped out of the car slowly, clutching Leo. They stood at opposite ends of time, one holding a grandson she'd never met, the other holding every ounce of pain she swore she'd buried. Her mother took a single step forward, then another. Tears welled instantly. "I wasn't strong," she whispered. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I was scared. Scared of what people would say, of losing the version of you I thought I raised. And in the end, I lost you anyway." Sophie said nothing. Her jaw trembled, but her arms stayed steady around Leo. Then her father appeared behind her mother, older, thinner, eyes rimmed in worry. He looked at the baby, at Leo, like he was seeing sunlight after years of night. Leo, unaware of legacy and shame, reached out a chubby hand toward him, and something shattered. Her mother fell to her knees, not sobbing, just crumbling. May I hold him?" Sophie hesitated, then slowly, wordlessly, placed Leo into her arms. The older woman clutched him like time itself had been handed back to her. She rocked him softly, whispering, "You look like her. You have her eyes, and more peace than we ever gave her." Sophie turned away. Daniel stood at the edge of the gravel, watching. Not interfering, not claiming, just witnessing. When Sophie turned back, when she saw Leo wrapped in her mother's arms, she didn't see betrayal. She saw a beginning. Later that evening, they sat around the kitchen table, the same table where Sophie once did homework, where her father read the newspaper every Sunday, where no one had spoken her name in 2 years. There was tea, warmth, soft laughter. Leo played with a spoon. Her father bounced him on one knee, eyes shining with something broken and beautiful. Sophie looked across the table, at her mother pouring tea, hands shaking slightly, then at Daniel, who gave her the smallest smile. Not proud, not triumphant, just present. She mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Daniel shook his head, smiling back. "No," he whispered under his breath. "Thank you for going home." 1 year later, the world was quieter. The noise faded. The headlines stopped. The donations had been spent, wisely and quietly, on shelters Sophie helped design. The social media storms vanished like fog. The eyes of judgment turned elsewhere, and in their place, life. It was a bright spring afternoon in Chicago. The breeze rolled soft over the grass, carrying the scent of new blossoms and old hope. Under the branches of an oak tree in Grant Park, the same park where once Sophie had wandered past full tables and linen-draped strangers, a humble wooden arch stood draped in ivy and white ribbon. No press, no choir, no spectacle, just the sound of the wind and the occasional laugh of a child chasing petals. And there, wobbling across the grass in a tiny navy vest and matching bow tie, was a boy. 2 years old now, cheeks round and bright, clutching something precious in both hands, a small velvet box. Leo, the same boy who once cooed over mashed potatoes, now grinned at the man standing just ahead. Daniel Whitmore. No longer the sharp-dressed titan of magazine covers, but a man in a soft gray blazer Sophie once said made him look almost human. His hair was longer, silvered. His hands? Steady. His eyes? Clear. As Leo reached him, the boy beamed and held out the box with both arms. Daniel knelt, eyes misting. "Thanks, buddy," he whispered, voice shaking. Leo giggled and toddled back toward the edge of the clearing, where Sophie stood. She wore no veil, no diamonds, no crown. Just a white cotton dress that fluttered in the breeze, and eyes that looked like everything Daniel never thought he'd have again. Alive, whole, home. She wasn't beautiful because of what she wore, but because of what she had lived through, and Daniel, who once thought his heart had died with his wife and son, now stood with it full again. Not replaced, but rebuilt. He stepped forward, box in hand, dropped to one knee, and the world seemed to hold its breath. "You didn't ask for anything," he said, voice low. "You didn't beg. You didn't expect. You just showed up, on the worst night of your life, and reminded me what it felt like, to be needed, to be alive." He opened the box, a simple ring, unflashy, real, chosen not for its sparkle, but for the way it would look on her hand when she held their son. "You didn't take my leftovers, Sophie. You gave me everything I didn't know I was missing. You gave me family. You gave me love. You gave me a future." His voice broke. "Will you marry me?" Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. She didn't cry, not right away. She laughed. The kind of laugh only survivors get to have. Loud, free, unstoppable. Then, tears. She dropped to her knees before him, wrapped her arms around his neck, and whispered, "Yes." The ceremony was short. No vowels too long. No speeches too grand. Just two people standing beneath an arch that smelled of fresh leaves and long journeys, and one child chasing butterflies in the grass. But it was during the vows, as Daniel spoke of not just loving Sophie, but choosing Leo, that something happened. Leo, mid-babble, wandered forward. He tugged Daniel's pants leg, looked up with wide eyes, and said clearly, "Daddy." Gasps, laughter, tears, lots of them. Daniel dropped to one knee, scooped the boy into his arms, and held him like a prayer answered late, but not lost. "I love you, son," he whispered into Leo's ear. Leo laid his head on his shoulder, just like always. The guests, just a few close friends and neighbors, stood quietly, hands to mouths, hearts in throats, because everyone knew this wasn't just a wedding, this was a homecoming. They danced in the grass that afternoon. No music, just Daniel humming, just Sophie barefoot, and Leo between them, spinning, squealing, lifted by two people who had nothing, until they found each other. Later, as the sun slipped behind the skyline and the oak tree cast long shadows over empty teacups and crumpled napkins, Daniel held Sophie's hand and said, "I used to think family was blood, but now I know. It's who you show up for. It's who chooses you back." Sophie leaned into him. "We're not perfect." "No," he smiled. "We don't need to be." That night, as Leo fell asleep in Daniel's arms, his head resting on his father's chest, Sophie whispered from across the couch, "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Daniel looked down at Leo, at the blanket, at the future they'd built from pieces, and whispered back, "You didn't need saving, Sophie. You just needed someone to stand still and see." And so, from one simple question whispered in a velvet restaurant, "May I have your leftovers, sir?" came a love that was never loud, but never left, a family not born of blood, but of choice, of courage, of compassion, and of a little boy who once smiled at mashed potatoes and called a stranger Daddy.